Well, we are here today on behalf of the National Charter School Founders Library with former Indiana State Senator Teresa Lubbers.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Well, we're so excited to do this. Indiana has a powerful story, and you are the right person to tell it because you gave a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to finally get a bill enacted.
It took us a while, but we got a good one once we finally passed it.
And you are persistent because you stayed at it for what, 7 years?
It took us 7 years, lots of bumps along the way. You know, the big thing that I really had as a challenge was, would we have a good bill when we finally passed it? Or would we have compromised so much along the way that it really didn't offer the kind of opportunity we wanted? I was convinced that the deal that we cut at the end was still for a very strong bill.
Wonderful. Well, we can't wait to hear about that, but let's go back to the beginning. Who is Teresa Lubbers?
Well, I've been around working in education policy for many years. I started as a practitioner, I guess, as a high school English teacher, but I'd been bit by the political bug early on in my life. Dick Lugar, who had been mayor of Indianapolis and then became our U.S. Senator, was my mentor for many, many years. And so I sort of took another route and went into politics for a while, worked in his office. But when I came back, and I decided to run for the Senate, I really ran because I cared about education and economic development and the relationship between the two. Serving in a state legislative body is almost intoxicating because you get to deal with so many issues on any given day. But I knew I didn't care proportionately about all those issues, even though I voted on all of them. And so I dedicated a lot of my time to really thinking about how do we build a system of education in Indiana that provided opportunity for all, that was accountable to families, and that at the end of the day really had some assurance that we were making sure that students were doing better and we weren't leaving people behind. In many ways, I have referred to myself as a reluctant convert to choice. I came up from public schools, and it took a while for me to understand that I redefined what public education was, and that it was simply the public funding of schools, and that could be done in a variety of settings to actually meet the needs of students. When you think about where we are today with almost the individualization of education, that's really where charters started. They started with, what is the need and how do we actually meet students where they are and make sure that they do better in the future. So I thought, naive as I was at that point, that it was based on freedom and accountability, and who could be opposed to that? I found out there were a few people who were. So anyhow, I did have the opportunity to serve in the state senate here, for 17 years and chaired the Education and Career Development Committee, and then left to continue my commitment to education, but I became the commissioner for higher ed and really worked to blur those lines between K-12 and higher education in the workforce, and have been committed to doing that. And then recently had the opportunity to join Sagamore, which is what we refer to as an action-oriented think tank. We love the research, the think tank part of things, but we really want to put ideas into action.
Well, you are a woman of action, so you're in the right place. Let's go back. You had a calling to education, right? You were a teacher, a high school teacher, English teacher. How did you get from a classroom teacher to passing the first charter school bill in Indiana?
You have to remember that at my age, that I was at the age when the world was changing for women. And if you were a professional woman, you tended to be a nurse, a teacher. There were certain things that you did, and the whole world was changing at that point. But I'd always had a commitment. I always knew that I wanted to teach, and I still consider myself a teacher in many ways. But I learned that there are lots of different ways to teach, and impacting policy was one way to really connect with the people that you served. So I actually had the opportunity. It was a bumpy road for my first election, but I had 10 elections after that between my primaries and my general elections. And the key issue for me remained really opportunity through education. We refer to education as the great equalizer, but it can be the great divider when some have it and some don't.
Amen to that, right? That's part of our calling, is to make sure everybody has it.
Right.
So you were elected to the Senate in 1992.
Yes.
Your first public office?
Yes, I never really thought I would run for public office. I always thought I would support other people with my time and whatever talent I had. I'd really worked, that's for other people. But candidly, I looked around and I thought, I think maybe I could do that job as well as some of the people who are there, and I really care about it, so maybe I should try. I was encouraged to do so by the woman who'd held the seat before me, so that helped a little bit as well. But, people talk about career choices and paths. I honestly can say I never envisioned myself as an 18-year-old to become a state senator, but there became a lot of compelling reasons why it seemed like a good path for me.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so take us back to 1992. Republicans control the Senate in Indiana. Democrats control the House. Governor Evan Bayh's a Democrat. What did you walk into, and what were those dynamics like trying to be a champion for charter schools?
Well, there were no supermajorities, which I think changes the nature of elected politics considerably. I can remember my very first year that I was there, my daughters were 6 and 8, and it was supposed to be, a part-time legislature, and we kept getting called back all the way through into the summer because we were dealing with tax issues and a variety of issues, and so it really taught me that early on that having partnerships and relationships mattered if you were really going to try to move big ideas. And, so I think at that point, when we were looking at education reform in Indiana, especially as we later looked at the charter bill, unfortunately, it became a partisan issue, which it really had not been in a lot of states. Or in some states, it was led by Democrats. In some states, it was led by Republicans. But what became clear in Indiana is that we were going to have both. Mm-hmm. We were not going to be successful without bringing the power of the idea so that people really embraced it and wanted to move ahead with it. When you look at the people who spoke in favor of it, and we were talking back then about whether it was President Clinton or you had, Evan Bayh, you had people who were open to the idea that multiple pathways would be acceptable within the public arena. And I think that took us a while to get to that place in Indiana, but we did have some people who were real trailblazers in both parties.
If we look back, there was the seminal report in 1986, A Nation at Risk, right? And then a whole lot of activity from threats to incentives to more money to other techniques that governors and lawmakers were trying to do to get change. And it just seemed like the district system was impervious to change. Your district as a senator included Indianapolis, and yet you're a state senator. What was going on in Indianapolis with the schools? What was happening statewide? And what was the impetus from kind of here's how education works to here's how it could work?
Well, I think that's a complicated answer, but yes, when I looked at my Senate district, I represented parts of Indianapolis up into the county north of here. So we had a variety of school districts, from highly performing public school districts to ones that weren't doing well at all. We'd seen an exodus of people living in the center part of the city to many of the counties around. We had a lagging narrative that was still going on about what schools should look like, locked into an industrial model, which really made sense in Indiana because we're the most manufacturing intensive state in the nation, much like Michigan and other states. And so the model was an outdated model. And so we were really saying, how do you preserve the best qualities of our schools while acknowledging that the model needs to change? It's not... even the idea that you might have people going to school in the summer, that we had a lot of pushback here because of when the state fair was, and you wouldn't want kids to go back to school before the fair was there. So you had a culture that you were talking about, a culture that varied dramatically and still does between urban, suburban, and rural. Rural legislators, when you think about that back then, I basically said to them, I understand you're probably not going to have a charter school right now. The idea of a charter school in some of those rural areas at that point, when the school was what was holding them together, it wasn't. I said, but if we need to have, or we want to have a charter school here, could we just have the freedom to have that? And then it's a choice. If you decide later on that you want one, which clearly became the case, then it's an option. So I think it was a matter of a lot of issues coming together at the right time. We weren't preparing students for the new economy. We were bound by a lot of collective bargaining agreements that were outdated. We had a adult-centric system of education, not a student-centric system of education, and we were trying to change that.
So Minnesota was the first state to pass a charter school law, and then California and Colorado and Michigan, and there was a flurry in 1993. You're trying to pass your first bill in 94, right? You don't get it done until 2001. Who were you hearing from? Were you trying to emulate anybody's law? Were there people you were talking to? Did you have a support network? Like, what kept you so focused to stay after this for 7 years?
Well, first of all, part of what helped me is that it was a part-time legislature. So when I would lose every year, I'd have some time to get myself worked back up again to try again the next year. But we had both external and outside of the state and inside the state help. So Jeannie Allen, Center for Education
yes.
Reform, was very involved with us. The state chamber here was very helpful to us. There was started a charter school association that became helpful even before we passed the bill, really trying to promote some of the ideas. So we had, I think that every year we got closer. We had a couple years where we nearly passed it, and then in the final hours of the session, it got, put together with something else and it went down. But so we were able to figure out what do we need to address to build some support for this. Clearly, it was very difficult. The work that we did with the State Teachers Association was very difficult. But we did get them to come to the table a little bit at the end. There were some trade-offs there. We had passed a bill that I'd been involved with, which actually in 1995, which limited collective bargaining in the Indianapolis public schools and to wages and benefits and not all of the other issues. And what happened was it really was never really practiced very much. The school board never really took advantage of that much. And we decided one of the trade-offs would be to restore collective bargaining to IPS in exchange for passing the charter school bill. A bit of an unholy kind of thing that you had to do at the end, but the other bill wasn't really making any measurable impact on what was happening, and I was convinced that the charter school bill would.
So you're about ready to celebrate 25 years of chartering. If you look at that trade-off to get the bill done, was it a good trade?
It was, because we have great charter schools here, and I think we have, and the ones that didn't turn out to be, as we all know, part of the whole premise of charter schools, if you don't make good on the promise, you got to give them time to do it. You can't do it the first year, but if they don't make good on the promise, then their charter is not extended. But the schools that we have here have been if you look at IPS, for example, the Indianapolis Public Schools, and you look at the students now, the majority of students are attending charter or innovative schools, about 51% actually in the Indianapolis Public Schools. And the performance for those who are attending those schools is higher than those performance for the students who are not. So if you really believe in accountability, which we trumpeted the whole time, for this, then we have a good story to tell in terms of the impact that it made.
That's wonderful. And even the charters that close, it's part of the promise, right? Because freedom and accountability.
That's exactly right.
We've heard from almost every state, right, that there was some trade. Governor Pataki talked about the pay raise that he had to negotiate. Ohio said, hey, at the time, every bill went through a OCR engine. And so they named theirs community schools and sponsors instead of authorizers so that the union wouldn't pick up on it and they could get the bill passed. Were there any stories like that coming out of Indiana?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I'd been trying to do with the bills and working with others was to make sure that we could provide flexibility in the teachers who taught there, so that if you wanted to hire, someone who teaching physics and they had a different background, or they wanted to teach Chinese or whatever, they could have some flexibility in hiring. And that was totally the collective bargaining agreement did not want that at all. I worked with a black state senator from Gary, Indiana, named Earlene Rogers, and she would say to me at the end of every session, when she had been on the education committee all the time, and we had a great working relationship, she taught me so much about understanding where someone lives and what they do that makes them vote the way they do. And even if you don't agree with them, if you understood that background, it gave you a place to finally work. So she would say to me, Lubbers, you don't get it. I am never going to support that bill unless you require all licensed teachers. And from that, we have the discussion. We created the transition to teaching bill, which was a part of the charter school bill that passed. It actually applied to schools other than charter schools, but said that you needed to be licensed or that you were participating in the transition to teaching bill. Okay. And eventually, she said with that, she would support the bill. And that was part of what broke the stalemate at the very end.
That's a great story. Okay, so you're a lawmaker, right? It's one thing to get a bill passed, it's another thing to get it implemented. What were the challenges of getting the bill implemented?
Well, I think we had the first year we had 10 charter schools that opened. And one of the good things about it is they opened in geographically different places. So we had a school here called Options, which tended to serve students who had not been well served in their traditional school system. Options still exists. And so Options started here in central Indiana. We had in southern Indiana, in Evansville, a highly performing school, still one of the highest ranked schools in the country, called Signature Charter School. And I remember speaking at the first graduation ceremony when they actually converted to charter status there. We had a school up in northwest Indiana called Campagna Charter School. So they were all different models of schools as well. Some people would refer to me as the mother of charter schools, and I said, well, I would always say, well, I'm watching to make sure my children do well. And so I think that it was really important to come alongside them, because the fact that we passed the bill didn't mean that there weren't going to be subsequent bills that tried to actually take away their power, take away their funding, or do something, limit them in terms of limit the number of authorizers, all of the kinds of things that we felt were really paramount to passing a good bill. And so for the first few years after that, we were in jeopardy all the time. And so you had to, both from a standpoint of the legislature, follow to make sure that something negative didn't happen, and then from the standpoint of starting charter schools, that they had the authority that they needed, that they had the funding that they needed. We were able to do full per pupil funding when we passed that bill, but they didn't have capital dollars, and they didn't have transportation dollars. And so we knew that they were going to be, stretched a little bit in that way as well. So I think it required constant vigilance. And to be honest with you, it still does.
Yeah.
It still does.
You got to play offense and defense.
Yeah. I mean, they're looking right now at opportunities now to make sure that, a portion of the referendum dollars that pass in local school districts can go to charters and innovative schools. And so I think that will be helpful. But, it is not as, right now, at least it is well known. Part of the problem with passing charter schools to begin with is people didn't understand what they were. So you were building brand awareness, of why people, even if you weren't going to do it, why it might be important for another place to do it. So you were building that understanding. That's not the case anymore. People understand it. Although I will say that I can't tell you the number of times people refer to these as public charter schools, which I always say is redundant.
Yes.
But I guess I'm willing to take it rather than have them say it's not a public school. But they were created with the public funding of schools, and so. But there's still, early on, people didn't understand them. They thought they were a pure voucher school. They thought they were for-profit schools. A lot of things have changed during those years, but we were building an understanding of what they are. Now, at least, there is an understanding, which doesn't always mean it's still easy, because people will still understand that through the lens at which they want to understand it.
So one of the stories of Indiana's charter law was that as state lawmakers, you gave the mayor of Indianapolis authority to charter a school. Right? He was the first mayor in the country with that authority. What was the relationship with Bart Peterson, and why did you bet on him?
I thought it made sense. Who's more accountable, to the voters in a city than the mayor? And he had expressed as a candidate, he'd actually even come and testified before the committee, to talk about why he was in favor of this new innovative idea. So it showed a lot of courage on his part. He clearly was willing to spill blood for this one, and did and continues to remain, very supportive of the idea. So we had lots of conversations about it, about this new model and whether Indianapolis could stand out as an example of doing this and doing it well, building partnerships. So I credit him, very much. He had been involved with Governor Bai prior to that. And so you were starting to see cracks in the opposition based on political ideology in both Republican states that didn't do it or Democrat states that didn't. You were starting to see a crack in that because you were seeing leaders who were willing to step up in unpredictable ways and say, back to what I said earlier, what I care about is not the institution. I care about the students we're serving. And so he was willing to use his political capital, even as he was gaining it, to go out on the limb and do this. And so I felt that it made sense, and there wouldn't be any good reason not to try it.
Yeah. We did an oral history of Will Marshall. Will was with the Democratic Leadership Council in D.C., and he told the story about then candidate Clinton and trying to convince him that charter public schools was the way to go. And obviously, Bill Clinton became president and was a champion for charters. But it's a fascinating dynamic to think of the courage with the labor union base to be pro-charters.
Right. Well, and Indiana is very strong labor mentality at this point. And as I mentioned, Earlene Rogers, who helped me at the end, was a former union steward. I often ask her, why did you finally do this? And she said, I kept my eyes on the kids. I kept my eyes on the students. And I think that caused her to be able to think that there could be different pathways. And as long as we were holding schools accountable for their results, people would often say about charter schools, they don't have the same regulations and requirements. To which I would reply, but they can be closed down. Back then, when was the last time we closed down a traditional public school for poor scores or not meeting their terms? So you have parents are making a decision to go there, and you have accountability that they can be closed. That's pretty strong accountability.
As you were working on your law, you had to pick who could be authorizers, right? So we've talked about the mayor's office, but you also allowed higher ed institutions to be authorizers. Why did you do that, and how was that played out?
One of the obstacles was early on that I walked away from the people who wanted only school boards to be the chartering entities. I was fine to let them be that, but I didn't want them to be the exclusive one because I didn't think we would really end up with any charter schools. And so, thinking about the mayor, we started thinking about that. And then Ball State University has been considered in the past the teacher's college. It was formed as a teacher's college. And I had worked with them some, and there was some reason to believe that they would step up and be willing to be a charter authorizer. So we required that if it was a school of an institution of higher ed, that they had to have a school of education to do it to start off with. Things have changed through the years, but it was one way for me to be able to say to people who might have been opponents, these people care about education, they have an education school, they know what's going on, they're training our teachers. So it seems to me that it makes sense for them to be able to actually be an authorizer. So we had school boards, we had the mayor, we had institutions of higher education that had a school of education. So we had multiple places that people could go. And then eventually there was a state charter school board that could do it as well.
We usually encourage lawmakers that when they pass a bill, that's when the work really starts, right? How do you get somebody to do it, meaning authorize it, get people to apply for a charter, serve on boards, just put the blood, sweat, and tears that it takes to stand up a new school.
It has to be a mission. I mean, they have to be they have to be mission driven, but then they have to understand all the things that could make it go well or go poorly. So if you don't understand the finances and you don't understand, the law, and you don't understand, if you haven't clarified what your mission is and why you're there, why it's important. So I think they have to, having business leaders come around. Sure. I think having had the chamber be a big supporter of the charter movement here in Indiana, we were able to go to the employer community to help with this as well. So we tried to build support in the public, the private, and the philanthropic sectors around the idea of charters, and then tried to provide the support that they needed, whether it was hiring practices or business practices, all the things that actually were the things that sometimes when charters didn't make it, that's why.
Right. So you mentioned Jeannie Allen and Center Ed Reform. Do you remember others inside the legislature, externally, that were supporters and allies with what you were trying to get done?
Well, I would say the chamber was a big one, and then we started a charter school association here that the last couple of years figured out a strategy that we could have to try to pass the bill. Eventually, and it took us 2 more years after that to do that. And I did look at other states to see what they were doing and to see that what we needed to do here, but I was very Indiana-centric in terms of how we developed this here. I think understanding the eccentricities of your own state, the relationships in your state, allows you to maybe refine that around what works in your state. There are some elements of charters that I think it doesn't make any difference which state you're in. But, a particular kind of charter school that you might want, if you wanted to start a STEM school because you needed to do that, or you wanted to start a school that was serving a geographically area that wasn't served well. So there were reasons why you might want to start those schools.
Right.
We just kept, looking at what I would often say to people at the end is, okay, so tell me why it is, again, you're not for this idea. And if not this, what would you be willing to do? And a lot of this was cultural, based on the strong commitment to traditional schools as they had been. A lot of it was generational. Mm-hmm. If you looked at women who were even a little older than I was, if they had been in the education arena, that was their pathway.
Yeah.
And so you were breaking down a culture and a legacy, and the only way you could really do it is to build relationships so that people trusted that you really had, your motivations were noble, even if they disagreed with your tactics.
So you've had a theme that you've been focused on the kids and their parents, right, if you will. Now that so many have chosen charters as the way to educate their children, and that power of choice that you've given them. If you look back in retrospective, did you think it would be that many, more or less? Like, how did you envision the future?
What I thought was, if we had enough of those schools and neighbors would be next to neighbors and they'd go, well, their son or daughter is going there, and I ought to at least think about whether that is a good option. So you started to pollinate the discussion with real life stories and people and schools. And so, the hardest part really of charter schools is we were betting on an idea, not a practice. We didn't have anything all we were doing is, trust us, this is going to work.
No proof point, right?
No proof point. And then all of a sudden we had all these exciting proof points. Yeah. So no, I wasn't surprised that people would gravitate to the idea once we had something in practice. But it was tough to sell an idea when it went counter to when it was change.
So when you're selling an idea, you're selling principles, right? Thoughts. What are some of the principles of chartering that you think really underpin the idea?
The first one is what I said before. It's freedom with accountability. We're not going to overregulate you and say that the state or the union knows how to do everything. Mm-hmm. But we are going to hold you accountable for your results. I think you needed to have multiple authorizers. You needed to have freedom from collective bargaining. We didn't outlaw collective bargaining, but if a charter school chose to, which they haven't, but we didn't require it. So, we provided that kind of flexibility and freedom. We looked at the fact that you could have different models, but that ultimately there would be certain areas that you'd have to hold them all accountable for. Clearly, safety and health and those kinds of issues were a part of what we did from the very beginning. So part of the reason why I think it took us so long is we could have sacrificed some of that early on, and it might have been easier to pass a bill earlier. But it wouldn't have been the right bill.
And it wouldn't have generated the results.
It wouldn't have.
So I'm hearing freedom within a framework, the power of choice, power of different models. Didn't mandate certain things, but left them a choice, like collective bargaining. Mm-hmm. And so those really are those freedom, accountability results are the underpinnings of this idea. And those are, some would say, timeless principles.
They are enduring principles, I think. And I think they're ones that we have to make sure our schools are accountable to those as well. One of the things I feared, and I think this is still a fear, is that over a period of time, for what will be appearing to be noble reasons, we will overregulate charter schools again. And we will try to make a singular model again. Because, let's just ask them to do this. Next year, let's ask them to do this. I'm all for asking them to provide as much data as we can about their performance. Everything should be transparent in terms of performance. But the idea of moving toward a more regulated system again, and this is often the case with system design. It's done for system redesign. We do it for noble reasons, but then people will actually come in and second guess that On the other side of system design is sometimes we don't think about the unintended consequences when we think about what our goal is. And that's why I think it was very important that charter schools hold to those basic principles and not get diverted from those.
I can hear all the people that govern and operate charter schools cheering, because charters were supposed to be freed from all the burdens. In so many places that didn't happen, but worse over time, it's been compounded. And
When they do it for noble, they think they're doing it for noble reasons.
Right.
How could you not have this school do this? And then, and so it kind of just, little by little,
And
you
it
change
compounds.
the whole,
Yep.
yeah.
And it wears you out, and when you only get 70% on the dollar, yes.
Right.
Okay, so you get the charters rolling, you decide to move on to Higher Education Commission. Tell us a little bit about that, and how did that maybe expand your thinking of higher ed's role as authorizers and what they could do? And then tell us the story about Mitch Daniels and Purdue and Purdue Polytechnic schools.
Well, when you think about higher education, it's always been pretty diverse. I mean, we have, 29, 30 private higher education institutions in Indiana, although I usually say we have 29 in Notre Dame because they stand alone in every way. And you have these 7 public systems. There have been a lot of different ways people could go to regional campuses. They could go to the community college. There were lots of things in the higher ed space that spoke to different pathways for students, while still holding to proficiency and as measured by, can they get a good job, for one thing. It became clear to me during the last few years that I was in the legislature that we had been able to stand up a strong charter school bill, and that we had advocates who were clearly going to not let it fade. And we had parents, we had examples. So while I remained vigilant about the idea that someone might try to come in and overregulate again, I felt that we were in a pretty good place. I'd spent an increasing amount of my time thinking about this relationship between what happens in the K-12 sector and what happens to the next chapter of someone's life, whether they go straight into the world of work or they go on into higher education, and what are the multiple pathways that ensure economic mobility. In many ways, economic mobility is what we were talking about with charters. And that's really what I was really focused on in higher education, that we were providing opportunities for economic mobility for people so that they could have a better life, a good job. I had the opportunity to be what's called a SHEO, a State Higher Education Executive Officer. Every state has a SHEO. I did it for 13 years. We did a lot of strategic planning during that time. One of the most interesting programs that really was the relationship between K-12 and certainly included charters and higher ed was our early college program, which was called the 21st Century Scholars Model. Really started under Stan Jones, who was the Democrat who came from actually Evan Bayh's administration. He became the commissioner of higher ed before I became the commissioner for higher ed. I worked with him a lot on standards in K-12. When I looked at that, the 21st Century Scholars Program, it was really about preparing people, not just giving them money to go to college, but getting them to first aspire to something beyond high school, whatever that might be, to prepare them during their years that they were in high school, and then to provide them the scholarship money. And if we look at our low-income students in Indiana, if they're a 21st century scholar, they're doing much better. If they're not a scholar, they're not doing as well.
Wow. Well, that's a powerful testimony.
So I think the whole idea of being able to continue that sort of mission that I had about opportunity and, economic mobility, and really looking at an economy that was dramatically changing during this time in Indiana, and a culture as well. And I thought that higher ed had a really important place to play.
As you look back and think how hard it was to pass choice within the public system, and now you see ed savings accounts, vouchers, scholarships happening, how do you process that? Is it just you paved the ground and it's more is possible now?
I think that parents have increasingly asked for more say in their children's education. And I hope a really healthy partnership. And that, they're looking that a singular model may not be right for every student. So choice, when you think about the word choice, it should be a positive word. I mean, there's giving people choice is, in terms of being able to choose where they want to go to school. Yeah, empowerment. And so I think you've seen the growth within the parent community. You've seen models that actually have done well. You've seen a willingness to walk away from ones that don't do well, which we weren't willing to do before. And I think all of those reasons have sort of gelled so that, you've seen a willingness to embrace diversity within public schools.
Which is fascinating to roll the clock back to, I'm going to say, before your bill passed, right? There was only one provider of public ed in a community. It was the district. Now you're getting a marketplace of choices that students and parents and teachers can choose to practice their craft at. That's quite a paradigm shift.
It is, but as someone who believes in the marketplace, I think that's actually because I think it's an authentic and true way to measure success.
So we would say that the great thing about a rising tide is it lifts all boats. As you look back, do you feel like charters have lifted all the boats?
Oh, absolutely. Well, we can always do better, we can always do more, but absolutely. I mean, we weren't even thinking about some of those students who were left behind. We were marginalizing many of them. We were actually, based on their background, often predicting what their future would be.
The prison to pipeline?
Yeah. I mean, we weren't even, so we weren't acknowledging that opportunity could come in lots of different shapes and sizes and that we could meet that. So I think it would be very hard to look at pre-charters and post-charters and not say that charters have been absolutely integral to lifting the boat.
So you've been a visionary from the time you began. You've got books like what we're going to be talking about in 30 years. Tell us about your vision. Where do you see education going in Indiana and nationally in the next 30 years?
Part of the reason why I think charters have been so interesting in this is I do think that they led the way to thinking about the personalization of education based on aspirations and aptitude and the needs of the economy. And so as you see this huge, for all the anxieties, for example, that AI creates, all of the opportunities it has to even to personalize. If someone's getting left behind, what kind of a tutor can be available to them? A hybrid school, the idea of a polytechnic school that you mentioned that Mitch Daniels started when he was at Purdue. So I think that when we think forward, it's difficult because the speed of change is amazing right now. But what I would say is if we are not proactive and we are only reactive to that change, we will once again leave people behind. Part of my personal motivation to really support education was that I grew up in a family that my father had a car dealership. I watched the car industry go south during that time, people losing their jobs during that time. And we did nothing to prepare those people for the changes that were coming. Many of those people, their dignity and their families has never been restored. And so we're in the throes of, we are tectonic change right now. And if we're not thinking about preparing people for those changes, we run the risk of driving income disparity and social stratification and polarization even more. And that's why even as someone who's old to this game, I'm always thinking about what it looks like for the next decade or two.
Well, because education's the equalizer, right?
It should be.
You're getting ready to celebrate 25 years of chartering. Did you think 25 years ago when you were trying to pass this idea that this is what it'd look like?
I was hopeful because I saw the potential and the possibilities and had the support of so many people who had a mission and who were purpose-driven about this whole movement to do something different about that, who were committed to sort of system change that had the student at the center. But I would not be speaking truthfully if I said I could have envisioned it going the way it has, with as many successes as that we've seen. But I think if I didn't think that, it's because I underestimated the power of people having an opportunity to make choices in their life.
As you think about charters having been the innovators and the disruptors, where do they sit now? Do they still have the edge where they're pushing new paths, or are they becoming their own status quo in a way?
That is a fair question, and one that we need to be very careful to be watching. I think back to this whole idea of how the world is going to change in the next 10 or 20 years, charters need to be at the center of that. They need to think about how does education change so that we're serving all students well, we're not leaving people behind, we're acknowledging the changes in the way people learn. I mean, the future of learning is going to look different.
Absolutely.
Part of what we did with the book that we did with the Workforce 2040 is we looked at the future of the workforce. Who is here? Who lives in these places? Where do they live? The future of work. What kind of jobs are coming? What kind of jobs are going away? What are the roles? And then the future of learning. How do we prepare people for those? And what's the obligation, for example, that employers have when jobs change? And how do they work with educators to do that? One of the chapters of our book was written by the state chamber as employers as educators, really coming alongside. So I think, if there is a new frontier, then charters need to claim that. And they cannot be a lagging narrative about as progressive as they might have been to look at those changes and the things that they needed in the past. That's not the future.
The world keeps moving.
So, how do you, those things that we were talking about that were key principles of charters, how do you remain true to those even while you're evolving into a new economy?
So you talked about it being important to have multiple authorizers, and you have different types. From district to mayor to higher ed. After you left, the legislature came back and allowed even private higher ed institutions to authorize. How do you look at your authorizing community? What do they do? Do they add value? What do you think is possible? And then Purdue, they weren't an authorizer, right? They started and incubated and operated schools, and they put the brand of Purdue on it. How did that change the dynamics?
I think a lot of it has to do in higher ed with the mission that institution has. And Purdue is an interesting place because it's always been known for innovation, whether it's through engineering or a lot of the things that they do. And so the idea of a polytechnic school, it was sort of, they purchased this idea really, and they integrated it with lots of different ideas. But I think that when you look at the new models, whether it was, private institutions being able to do it. The key, I think there are two keys that are paramount to saving that. One, the school can look for a new authorizer if they're not getting what they need, and the authorizer can go to the school and say, you're not doing what you're supposed to. So it's really, there is some symmetry there between why they need each other.
Dual accountability, which is healthy.
Absolutely.
You can't talk about education without talking about funding. Charters generally start off on 70 cents of the dollar compared to their district counterparts. Some states have closed that gap over time, others haven't. Where does Indiana sit, and what do you see as the future of funding these educational choices as they blossom?
Well, clearly, even though we had the full per pupil, we didn't have all those other dollars, so they were at a disadvantage. Some people have the wrong memory of this. They'll say, you always sold this as being a cheaper model. I said, no, we didn't sell it as a cheaper model. We sold it as the only model, this is what we needed to do. We didn't say they didn't need transportation dollars or capital, but we couldn't get it, so we took what we could get. Now I think the conversation in Indiana is very much about any student deserves the same funding regardless of where they go to school. And so you're seeing a true pushback even as recently as this week. I mean, right now in the General Assembly, looking for a fair sharing of referendum property tax dollars going to charters. And I think you're going to continue to see that as we've sort of blurred the lines between what public education means and what public funding of education means. Not just a singular delivery model, but a model that actually sends money to the students based on...
Yeah. There's a number of cities around the country now where over half the students are in charter public schools, right? Detroit's an example. You mentioned Indianapolis. When you reach that tipping point of half, does that change the political dynamics and the ability to do some of those things with funding?
It does. It certainly does. It doesn't take away from the fact that there's still real pushback, because what happens is once you redistribute dollars, as you know, some get more and some get less. And so you're always going to have that tension from those who believe that they're receiving less, even though you could argue that it's closer to fair funding.
Yes.
And so you're seeing the pushback. You certainly are seeing the pushback from those who think that, for whatever reason, They're going to have to close schools in traditional settings.
So with all your experience, if you all of a sudden ended up being the superintendent of a school district, how would you think about operating it?
I would think about building, and we tried to do this in higher ed when we did our strategic plan. We changed it from being a institutionally centered system of higher education to being a learner-centered system. I would want a school district to be student-centered, which meant that you could have different models even within the same schools. You could have, not every student reads at third grade level at the same level. But do you have to put them all in the same place at the same way, or do you give the support that some need, and do you let the others move? And so this differentiated model, we always talk about it in terms of pay. I think it's a differentiated model in terms of the delivery system as well. So the situation of a superintendent, I know you have all kinds of considerations that you have to have, but paramount to what you should be doing is I'm keeping the student at the center of everything that I do. The teachers serve the students, and the families are served by the schools. That doesn't mean that in no way takes away. In fact, it empowers the value of quality teachers. Teachers are what make the difference. Mm-hmm. And we all know that. We all talk about the teachers who made a difference in our lives. But I do think that but keeping the learner at the center allows you the freedom to think about different delivery systems, even within one school district.
Well, it's the right lens, right? Because that's where the learning takes place, is with the student, mm-hmm. not with the system. Mm-hmm. And so there's been these conversations about a system of schools instead of a school system. Your thoughts on? Micro
schools you'll talk about, there are all kinds of new models that, because it's changed, there'll be anxiety associated with it. But reluctance to actually embrace the kind of change that actually moves student proficiency forward, is not the answer. Sure. So, we could sit where we are forever and just say, well, we're trying really hard.
So one of the goals of the Founders Library is that future lawmakers can watch this and learn. How did you do this? Oh, it wasn't overnight. It took 7 years. What wisdom would you pass on to future lawmakers?
Well, I'm not sure I would say it's wisdom. I would say maybe based on experience and hopefully a little bit of lessons I've learned along the way. I do think if you know something about other lawmakers you're working with, what areas they represent, what they've done in their life, why they think what they do, what they're anxious about, and then you speak to that in a way that allows them to actually see that what their anxiety is, they could actually speak to that by this other model, and you sort of meet them halfway. So I think having a degree of understanding allows you to be in that conversation. Your word has to mean something. You have to be, you have to have people who develop some trust, even if they disagree with you. They might say, I don't agree with Lubbers, but she at least shot straight with me. And then they trust you. They trust your word. That you acknowledge their pathway. You talked about what they care about too, which is having their students do better. Acknowledge that quality teachers make a difference. All of those things, I think, in the context of the conversation, can allow you to talk to even those who may perceive themselves as being on the other side.
So really getting to know the person.
Absolutely.
What makes them tick, what their pressures are, and then finding common solutions.
That's right. And that means sometimes you might have to, sacrifice the perfect for the good if you're still moving in the direction you want, as long as you won't sacrifice too much.
So the art of the compromise, but also the non-negotiables.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it.
You've accomplished so much. Where do charters fit in?
To what I think about my accomplishments?
As you think about, your everything you're proud of, where do charters fit into that?
Well, absolutely. If I think about my 17 years in the Senate, they're at the top. I spent more time working on that. I spent more of my political capital on that. I have more evidence of the fact that it made a difference. So, I think it's what I'm still, if people know anything about my time that I serve, they would say that, as the chair of the Education Committee, I really fought for opportunities for students, and they would put charters right at the top of that as well. So yeah, it's at the top.
All right. It's been interesting to talk to governors because they say, you know, once you leave office, a lot of your stuff gets undone. But with charters, it continued and grew, and, you know, just a huge point of pride for them. Is that similar to a senator?
I think so. I remember my last day when I was leaving, and you know, I watched a lot of other people who left, and you go up and they say nice things about you and everything, and people often say, you know, what really mattered to me was the friendships that I made. And what I said was, you know, I really value the friendships I made, but what I really value is the opportunity I had to make a difference. And so you get this period of time when you're there, may not remember you by name, but did you do something that mattered? Mm-hmm. And that's what I valued about my time in the Senate.
The windows of opportunity.
Yeah, hopefully, yes.
As you think about your legacy, how would you like to be remembered?
I believe that what I would want to be remembered for is that I had some courage to take on some big ideas based on the possibilities of making really improvement in people's lives. And that I didn't shy away from a hard battle, but that I tried to do it in a way that was collegial and that the efforts were sustainable. Because and by that I mean that I brought enough people along that even if I wasn't there, the efforts were sustained over a period of time. And that's the real measure of success. Not that you passed something that was revolutionary or, you know, real trailblazing, but that it was sustained and got better. That's what I would hope happened.
I would say it has. That's the story of Indiana, on the move.
I hope so.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, I just think that, you know, I appreciate the opportunity to just reflect a little bit on the journey that we had here in Indiana. And you know, we're never done, you know, so we have to keep thinking about the future and ways of making sure that we're building a quality system that doesn't leave people behind.
Well, on behalf of our entire team at the National Charter School Founders Library, it's a pleasure to be able to record your oral history, and just compliments to the tenacity and the perseverance and the fortitude you've shown over the years. You have been a difference maker, and we call them art changers, right? As Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe does bend, but not without us. And
well, I would certainly put you in the category as well. So what you've done over all these years is amazing, and what the Institute continues to do. So thank you as well.
All right.